He told Agata that he would conduct such an examination, but the condition is that Agata has to have an orgasm. Well, Agata hesitated for a while. Hello, welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. Today, a story about Count Zdzisław Mieszkowski. Count Zdzisław Mieszkowski, just the title Count already sounds impressive, but you should know that he's also an outstanding specialist in oncology, the owner of 2 clinics, one in Geneva and the other in Seville, and also an heir of Malta. He was a well-traveled man. He had his own small plane, and with that plane he traveled all over Europe. Various clinics and hospitals often made use of his expertise. He was also the heir to Malta. He had the Montresor Castle on the Loire, lots of connections, and most importantly, he was the father-in-law of Antonio Banderas, the famous Spanish-American actor and model. You have to admit, if you met someone like that and he started talking to you, if you knew his dossier, you would be impressed. Count Zdzisław Mieszkowski was really counting on making that impression. In reality, Count Zdzisław Mieszkowski is actually Zdzisław M, or maybe more like Zdzisek M, a welder from Pruszków. So, as you can see, he wasn't any kind of specialist unless you count welding. Zdzisław M was from Pruszków. That's where he lived. Things weren't going well with his wife. And on top of that, he even had a case for abusing her. He got a sentence. He spent some time in prison. When he got out, he knew that he probably wouldn't stay in Pruszków much longer. So he decided to set out into the world. Well, I have to admit his appearance was, I'd say average. He was 56 years old at the time. Education, well, practically none, but he could talk, he could tell stories, and he could also make an impression, which in his next life was of enormous importance. Zdzisław M. arrives in Podhal, initially in Szaflary. In the shopping mall, he meets 19-year-old Daria earlier. He simply sat down next to her when she was in the shopping mall and started talking. Daria was very impressed by him because she met someone, a real cosmopolitan, a specialist, with all those qualities I told you about earlier. They began speaking word by word. All in all, Daria was so impressed by him that she invited him to her house. She introduced him to her parents, presented him, and I think Daria's parents liked him too, because he stayed at the house and started living with them. What's more, they both started preparing for the wedding. She was 19, he was 56, but that's a minimal age difference, and I guess it didn't really bother anyone. Anyway, the wedding was supposed to be grand. As Count Mieszkowski said, because that's how he always introduced himself, the wedding would be at Wawel. It would be officiated by Cardinal Dziwisz himself. Hundreds of guests from all over the world would be invited. He himself is supposed to provide for this purpose about 200,000 euros. Strangely enough, he had trouble with the payment, with the cards. His payment cards were being blocked. Because of that, in the meantime, while he was talking about the wedding and telling this story about how much he would spend, he was borrowing small amounts of money from Daria's parents, but Daria was also extorting money from her own parents to pass it on quietly to her fiancé, and of course this went on for some time. At that time, it suddenly turned out that women started reporting to police stations practically all over Poland. Women of different ages, but women who began filing complaints against Count Mieszkowski. Why were the ladies reporting to police stations all over Poland? Because Count Miskowski traveled all over Poland, meeting women literally everywhere. These were train stations, airports, shopping malls, and restaurants. Everywhere people gathered, he would simply sit next to someone, start a conversation, and begin talking about himself. Usually his acquaintance or making an impression was divided into two stages. The first stage was about who this woman was dealing with, meaning what we talked about, that he was a count, fabulously wealthy, owned clinics, and was an outstanding specialist in oncology. And there were plenty of those wonderful stories he told about himself, and once the woman was impressed by this persona. And he would look deeply into her eyes and say, "I see a deadly disease in you." Most often it was either pancreatic cancer or ovarian cancer. Well, you can imagine what a woman went through when she suddenly found out she was terminally ill, especially when such a distinguished specialist told her so. For sure, for many women, their world simply collapsed. And the life she knew so far just fell apart, so it was really terrible. But that was exactly the intended effect when a devastated woman asked Count, well, what to do in such a situation. He says that, of course, he won't leave her in need, that he'll help her, that he'll start her treatment. However, he said that he has these two clinics in Geneva or maybe in Seville. But as for the treatment, it takes place like there are two possibilities. First of all, well, it can be a complicated surgery, basically a series of surgeries. He will perform such a surgery in one of his clinics. But yes, above all, it is a long process. It doesn't bring any special results. And secondly, it's very expensive. And another thing is he has a lot of patients. And right now, there's simply no space. So there is such a possibility, but there was also a second option, and that's the key to all of this, because Count Miskowski developed a special method, unique, amazing, revolutionary for treatment. Cancer. He treated cancer with sex, using special techniques. As he said, he developed a special method of movements that targeted the sick areas. But the condition for the whole procedure to succeed was that the woman had to have an orgasm. If you're wondering whether this is possible nowadays, I'll say that it is possible. That indeed, dozens of women actually underwent this therapy. What's more, some of them repeated this procedure several times to achieve better treatment results. But of course, such an outstanding specialist as Count Miskowski couldn't do this for free. He was, in a way, making a sacrifice, as he said. For each such procedure, he charged 1,300 zlotys. That's how much it cost. Well, I would say the use of his extraordinary moves. So indeed, women paid. Later, when Count Miskowski disappeared with their money, some women started to wonder if it was even possible. They asked specialists, some of them got tested, and it turned out they had never been sick with anything. That they were healthy, that they had simply fallen victim to a scam. Well, probably only some of these women decided to come to the police station and give such statements. It's still a barrier of shame. So you definitely have to suspect that only some of them reported it. This kind of testimony, nevertheless, there were a lot of them, and they came from all over Poland. When things started to get noisy, when there was movement, when Count Miskowski realized that the police were on his trail, he took this 19-year-old Daria, who, by the way, was also helping him. It turned out that she was so manipulated by him that she was actually bringing him clients herself. And he was simply treating them with his unique method, sex therapy. He also treated those women who were lured in by Daria. But when he realized that the police were on his trail, he took Daria, escaped to Spain, and hid there for a while. At some point, the police even got on Daria's trail. There was a conversation with her there, but she said she was 19 years old, had no intention of returning to the country, and would stay in Spain with her partner. You have goods. It lasted for a while, but eventually they ran out of money, returned to the country, and came back to Poland. Count started his business again because, after all, he didn't have any money. The police were on his trail and arrested him just a few meters from here in the Krakow Market Square because there is surveillance in the square. They saw him meeting with another of his patients there and arrested him literally at the moment when he was telling all his nonsense to this next patient. Count Zdzisław Myszkowski, also known as Zdzisek M. Spawarz from Pruszków, was released from prison on June 27, 2016. He spent 5 years in prison. Daria also got a sentence. It was 2 years suspended for 2 years for helping him with all of this, basically recruiting clients. And it would seem at this point that the story of the count who heals with sex ends here, comes to an end, but that's not the case at all. It's January 10th, 2017, McDonald's in Warsaw. There sits Kamila with her friend. They went there to get something to eat. At some point, an older man joins them. He sits down and they start talking. He introduced himself as a top oncologist. He says that he has a clinic, but this time it's a royal clinic in Madrid, that he treats and takes care of patients there. He also shows a phone, and on this phone he has a special app. He shows them and says that on this phone he has the names of his patients. Indeed, there are some names there. He also says that he has developed a special method. It consists in the fact that his patients have a phone. With this phone they take pictures of their skin. They send him this picture of their skin. He is able to assess what's going on, what procedure is needed, and he can react very quickly because he can irradiate the affected area remotely so that the disease doesn't progress. He says that he developed it, that he treats people all over the world. Well, he introduced himself a bit differently. This time he was no longer Count Myszkowski, but Marek Radkowski. That's the name he introduced himself with. But again, there was this claim that, for example, he is Antonio Banderas' father-in-law. Well, anyway, Kamila was very impressed by this older gentleman she met. Yes, an outstanding specialist and an exceptional expert. It turned out again that this wealthy man, he also told them that he has a private plane, that he has a daughter whom he loves very much, that he and his daughter fly this plane all over the world, that they travel, and that his wife passed away recently. Kamila is very impressed. At the end of the meeting, he even asked her why she doesn't wear glasses. Actually, she does have a vision problem and she should wear glasses. Well, that convinced her even more that he was a specialist. He also talks about the field of iridology, which is the science of reading diseases from the eye, more specifically from the iris. He talks a lot about it in such a vivid way. In the end, it turns out that he's having trouble with payments again, that it turned out his payment cards were blocked. This meeting at McDonald's ends with Kamila taking from him an email address. Meanwhile, his friend takes him home. It turns out later that he spent the night at his place, and in the end, he also took a significant amount of money from Kamila's friend for a ticket to Belize. Kamila wrote him an email the very next day. Kamila wrote to him very quickly because he made her understand that he saw the beginnings of an illness in her, that it could be a very serious and dangerous disease. What's more, after that email, they agreed to meet at Banaccia Hospital. And indeed, Kamila went to that meeting. In the hallway, she met Marek Ronkowski, that outstanding oncologist. Well, the hospital, he said he's here for a consultation, that they very often use his expertise. But he says they won't talk here in the hospital, they'll go for a walk instead. when they were walking openly, he told her that he saw the beginnings of a deadly disease in her. Unfortunately, it's cancer. Well, Kamila was devastated. He said they would have to treat it. That, of course, procedures would be necessary. Of course, he'll install his app on her phone that, well, he has to take action here to get treated. Kamila said that, of course, she agrees to everything, that she will get treatment. They arranged to meet the next day in front of the oncology center. That's already in Ursinov. They were supposed to meet there. As they left after meeting at Banacha Hospital, he took 200 zlotys from her for fuel for the small plane, claiming he needed it. They blocked his cards and he needed money for that fuel. They parted ways and were supposed to meet the next day at that center. He didn't show up for that meeting. He didn't come to the meeting, but he did send an email saying that unfortunately he couldn't make it to Ursinov because one of the ministers here in Poland put him on the persona non grata list and he simply couldn't fly his small plane into Poland. Well, he apologized to her. Kamila, when letting him in, quite sensibly started looking for information about this outstanding person, after all, a specialist. On the internet, and that's where she came across articles about Count Myskowski. The surname was different, Rondkowski here, Mishkowski there, but everything else matched, like running clinics and being an outstanding specialist. And then she contacted the journalists who wrote about him, who wrote those articles about him as Count Myskowski. Yes, without a doubt. Based on the description and the way he operated, the journalists were convinced that this was the very con man roaming around Poland. They reported this to the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, and together they planned an ambush for Count Myskowski, also known as Rondkowski. This ambush was supposed to take place in one of the restaurants in Warsaw. Kamila took part in this. She wrote him an email. He replied that he would come to Poland. It was supposed to look like this. First, we met with Kamila. They will meet in one of the restaurants, then she will rent a room in one of the hotels in Warsaw. He will conduct the exam in that hotel room. Then she will buy a mobile phone, give him that mobile phone so that he can install the application. Well, that's about how it was meant to look. This ambush was planned for February 8th, 2017. Kamila was supposed to go into the restaurant with him. Maki and she were waiting outside, and he was supposed to be detained as soon as he left the restaurant. And it turned out that Kamila had intercepted this man, this fraudster, earlier. Probably what happened was the so-called Stockholm Syndrome, meaning identifying with the perpetrator, a certain kind of sympathy towards him. Maybe also the belief that what he was saying was true. In any case, it looks like Kamila simply warned him. She told him that there was a joint ambush by both journalists and police officers. She left with him, they walked a bit further, and then, as she said, she ran away and left him alone on the street. Nevertheless, thanks to this, the fraudster avoided, I would say, another arrest by the police and was able to continue his activities. Count Rondkowski reappears, now introducing himself as Marek Rondkowski. This time he appears in Wrocław on November 24, 2017. There's a youth hostel there. In November, Agata arrives at that hostel. When she has classes in Wrocław, that's where she stays and lives. And when she entered the kitchen, she heard a conversation between two men. Well, one of them. This one was especially eloquent. He was talking about his practice in clinics, exactly what you already know, that he owns clinics, that he is an outstanding specialist in the field of oncology. He really made an impression on her because she heard him speak, how he talked. She later said it was a huge amount of knowledge. When Agata was left alone with the older gentleman, he bluntly told her right away that he saw a deadly illness in her, that it was probably the beginnings of pancreatic cancer. He also asked her about how long her back had been hurting, how long her hair had been falling out, and how long her breasts had been hurting. Well, Agata was a bit surprised because she didn't have those symptoms. She was a young, healthy woman. She thought she was healthy, and then suddenly something like this. Such a diagnosis by such a specialist. They started talking, and he was convincing her more and more. Even Agata, very sensibly at one point, says, "You're so fabulously rich, you fly all over Europe, and yet you live in a shelter." And he told her that it's like a connection with his recently deceased wife, that he loved his wife very much, that many years ago, when they were already wealthy, at that Hilton, the receptionist looked at them with a certain disdain. They realized that this wasn't a place for them. So they didn't admit that they were millionaires, but they left that Hilton, went to a hostel, and spent the night there. And now, kind of in solidarity or feeling connected to his late wife, whenever he's in a city or a country, he always stays in rather modest conditions. Well, that convinced Agata. Then he started telling her about treatment options. He also planted a bit of worry, suggesting that it could indeed be a deadly disease, but it could also be symptoms of a completely different illness. Of course, he read all of this in Agata's eyes, looking at her deeply. He says that in order to determine for sure that it's cancer, he needs to run some tests. This test would involve him checking whether Agata hasn't accidentally experienced atrophy of her reproductive organs or, on the other hand, their growth. Well, he had to conduct such an examination. He told Agata that he would do it, but the condition is that Agata has to have an orgasm. Well, Agata hesitated for a while, then said she agreed to such an examination, but only on the condition that she wouldn't have an orgasm. He agreed as well. Then it turned out, as she said, that he conducted such an examination that he did it in the kitchen where they were. When Agata was asked if they had any tools, Agata replied that no, he did it with his fingers. So the situation is also extremely astonishing. Of course, Ronkowski, because again he introduced himself as Marek Ronkowski, talked about having a wonderful daughter, Angela, that Angela is actually the wife of Antonio Banderas, and that he is naturally his father-in-law. That also made an impression. Then he told Agata that he would take care of her, that they would stay in touch, and that he would treat her if there was a need. In the end, it turned out that he wanted to buy a watch for 216,000 zlotys, which is quite a lot for a watch, but he miscalculated the euro to zloty exchange rate, so he was short in total. And in the end, he took 300 zlotys from Agata for a ticket to Baileys, because that's exactly how much he was missing. Of course, Agata gave him the 300 zlotys. Ronkowski disappears, Agata writes to him. She has his email address, and for a while he doesn't respond. And later, supposedly, his daughter Angela replies on his behalf. Angela wrote to her in broken Polish, saying that after her dad returned from Wrocław, when he had already flown back, he fell into a coma, that he was unconscious, that he just fell. Presumably, he fell into a coma because he took Agata's illness upon himself, that he preferred to die himself rather than let such a young girl suffer and be sick, that in this way he sacrificed himself for her. And then the email stopped. Neither Ronkowski nor his daughter Angela replied. The contact just broke off. It seems that Count Miskowski, also known as Ronkowski, also known as Roj from the Branicki family because he used that name too, is still wandering around Poland, and there are also reports that he might be wandering around Europe. It also seems that right now he's less interested in treatment with sex. Well, he's getting older, so it's not surprising. Right now, he's more focused on selling his miraculous app where he can treat people remotely using radio waves. Of course, this app also costs quite a lot. It circulates, it travels. Supposedly you can run into him, so we're talking about this also because, well, of course, it mainly concerns women, that you might encounter him somewhere along your life path. So we're talking about it. We're making an appeal simply. Don't let yourselves be fooled by the welder from Pruskov's Gisco N who found this way of life. He makes up for his lack of looks and education with more audacity, but no matter what you say, he's effective. Because when we look at all of this, even though some parts of what I said might sound almost unbelievable these days, it's still the truth. So maybe Zizek can just keep convincing people, keep fooling them, and keep deceiving them. Of course, he might also be using a different last name now than the one we know. This story might also change a bit because, after all, he also talked about things I haven't mentioned before, since there are so many such parts. For example, that he treated Pope John Paul II. Well, but these stories are quite similar to each other. If someone knows this story, they certainly won't be fooled. And that's it for today's story. Of course, subscribe to our channel, click the bell, and of course, take care.